מאז שיש הטלפונים, אני מסתובב בלי שעון, אבל יש לי אחד לשבת, במזוודה שלי, אבל רציתי להביא אותו שם.
יכול להשאיר את זה פתוח, ואז
כן, אני מסתכל מדי פעם, אם אני משפר פה כל הזמן.
נקבע מותו של הפצוע בפיגוע ירי ליד גדולים.
מה?
נקבע מותו של הפצוע.
אתמול.
היום.
לא, אבל פצוע מאתמול, לא?
לא חושב.
זה היום?
ליד גדולים זה היום, לא?
ליד גדולים.
זה פתוח שלהם. כן, ב-1:49. זה משעה. אתה בקשר עם אקמן?
לעתים רחוקות.
אשתו נפטרה.
זמן. אשתו הייתה יהודייה. בת של ניצולי שואה. אני לא ידעתי, קראתי, זה לא זוכר. אקמן...
גם הוא יהודי. גם הוא יהודי.
מי?
ג'יימס אקמן.
לא.
לא? הוא יודע המון על יהדות, הייתי איתו...
מה?
הוא יודע המון על יהדות. הייתי איתו בתוניסיה.
כן, ראיתי...
ואז הוא נפטר להוצאה בעצם.
You are going to present Jacques.
Okay, yes, sure. Now?
Wait for a second.
We have 2 minutes, at least.
לא, הוא כתב לא מבוא, ככה, ההנדבוק שערכתי, הוא כתב, דף קוראים לזה. פריפס. חצי עלם.
הוא בחור טוב, הוא הציג בסמינר שלי, ואז הוא רצה עוד פעם להמשיך את זה בשעה בעוד שבוע, אחרי הסמינר, להוסיף לו עוד שעה, הוא רצה לדבר עם אנשים.
כשכתבתי תזה, אני ראיתי אותו אולי פעם או פעמיים, לא יודע, אבל לפני כמה שנים ראיתי אותו באחד הכנסים, אני זוכר את זה. סילבר, אתה זוכר? Of course, I'm following what you do. אז מאז ראיתי אותו כמה פעמים, וביקשתי ממנו לכתוב את זה.
מה עם נרלוב? נרלוב נפטר?
נרלוב עוד חי, בדרך כלל כשאני, אבל הוא היה תמיד בוושינגטון, גם הבן שלי היה בוושינגטון, אז כל פעם שהייתי אצל הבן שלי הייתי בוושינגטון. הוא חזר לשיקגו, בפרברים של שיקגו, יש לנו בשתי בנות שלה, אני לא יודע. וכל פעם שהייתי מבקר את נרלוב, הייתי כותב לאקמן, הם היו חבר טובים שלא הייתי את נרלוב. עכשיו בסתיו אני מבקר את הבן שלי, הוא גר בפיטסבורג. יכול להיות שאני אקפוץ לשיקגו, עוד משהו יותר. אני חייב לו הרבה, תשמע. ממני 2.5 2.5. הוא גם היה נכנע. אבל הוא קרוב ל-90.
דווקא די מעריכים... דווקא את כולם מעריכים...
כן, נשמע. אחד המנחים שלי היה TW שולס, ב-93 הוא ערך ספרים. אני חושב שבין 97 שנפטר. אוקשמן ונרלוב.
Okay, very good. Good afternoon. Thank you for the organizers, Jose Maria Montero and Nikhil. I'm going to introduce the next speaker after the good lunch. So the next speaker is Jacques Silber, or Jackie. He is a professor emeritus of economics at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. His PhD is from University of Chicago. He wrote under Nerlov, Schultz, and James Heckman. Schultz and James Heckman got a Nobel Prize, and Nerlov is still active and doing some work and so on. He's the founding editor of the Journal of Economic Inequality. So Jackie is really an expert in economic inequality in general. In 2011-2013, he was president of the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality. So we are talking about many years of being involved in this topic. I calculated that I think I know this speaker for about 40 years. I met him at Bar-Ilan when I came from University of Minnesota many, many years ago. And then when I left Bar-Ilan to go to University of Pennsylvania, we still keep in touch, and I was following, as we say, his research and so on. Professor Silber is a specialist in the measurement of economic inequality, poverty, and segregation. He's the author of close to 200 scientific papers that have been published in books and international academic journals. He's the famous editor of the Handbook on Income Inequality Measurement, very important handbook that many of us are looking at and using. Several other books and edited special issues of various academic reviews. I remember a conference at Bar-Ilan that he was reviewing it and so on. More recently, now we are talking about this year, more recently he edited a research handbook on measuring poverty and deprivation. This was published in 2023, this year, by Edward Elgar. He is going to present his paper about hierarchical choice and measurement of the standard of living. Personally, he is a proud great-grandfather. We are talking about 4th generation of the Silber family, as that all of them are active and all of them are doing very well. And Jackie is a good friend, and I don't know, there is something that we need to talk about when we talk about immigration of people from other countries to Israel. So coming from France, this is an amazing. His co-author is a guy who came from Argentina, Yossi Deutsch, Professor Joseph Deutsch, and others. So again, we can learn a lot. And I'm talking about the young student here from Portugal. We can learn a lot how to integrate immigrants in the right way, in a positive way. Israel, as you all know, has a solid middle income group, class, whereas in Portugal, those guys are disappearing. So talking about inequality, again, there is cost of living in Israel, people are living, and so on and so on. But generally speaking, I think Israel learned how to overcome differences and so on. And we are all very proud of the state of Israel. Just to give you an idea, two of the keynote speakers in this inequality seminar conference, Oded Galor and Jacques Silber, are educated in Israel or work in Israel. And again, you can see how we are, the synergies that we are getting out of the immigrations. So, Jackie.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yochanan, a former colleague of mine for many years. And I would like to thank the organizer of this conference for inviting me, Jose Maria Montero, and also Pablo Cousteau, who have been taking care of me as soon as I arrived on Sunday at 10 o'clock. until today. I mean, they took care of me like a baby. So thank you very, very, very much for your more than warm welcome. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about hierarchy of needs and the measurement of poverty and standard of living. This is based on joint work I'm doing with a good friend of mine, a colleague, Joseph Deutsch. Okay, so for most economists, an important assumption underlying the notion of rational behavior is that economic agents compare bundles of goods by reducing everything to a common denominator called utility. For example, standard consumer theory assumes that the loss of some units of a given commodity in one bundle can be compensated by the gain of some units of another commodity. Some economists questioned such an assumption and adopted the notion of hierarchical, I'm not sure I pronounce it correctly, preferences. Most economists rejected such an approach because it reminds them of the notion of lexicographic ordering, which violates the axiom of continuity and prevents the existence of a general equilibrium. Hence, they argue it cannot have a wide application in economics. However, there are other economists who do not agree. Pasinetti is one of those economists who argued in favor of hierarchical preferences. Let me cite something from that Pasinetti wrote, which is cited in an article by Lavoie. Although possibilities of substitution among commodities are, of course, relevant at any given level of real income, there exists a hierarchy of needs. More precisely, there exists a very definite order of priority in consumer wants, and therefore among group of goods and services. I'm emphasizing groups of goods and services, which manifests itself as real income increases. For Lavoie, most economists put too much emphasis on substitution effects, and they tend to neglect income effects. In fact, in a famous textbook by Deaton and Wilbur, it is written that when working with general categories of consumption expenditure, it turns out that own price and cross-elasticity are very small, not higher than 0.5 in absolute value for the own price elasticity of categories such as food, travel, entertainment. For Lavoie, this is so because large categories of expenditures are derived from needs that cannot be substituted. But there may be substitution effect within each of these consumption categories. This emphasis on groups of goods appeared already in the 40s in an important article of the French economist René Roy. Let me say a few words about René Roy that you know probably under the name of Roy's identity. But in French you say Roy, you don't say Roy. Now René Roy, I learned this when I was preparing this talk, was wounded in World War I and lost his sight at the age of 17 or 18. And this did not prevent him from writing quite a few articles in Econometrica. And as you know, Roy's identity is very famous in duality theory, in microeconomics, and you can imagine what kind of intellect this person had to be able to write papers in Econometrica to find a result like Roy's identity while being blind. So what did Roy say? He said that it is possible to establish among all the goods and services a classification into groups such that any consumer has access to a group of a certain order only after having ensured the satiety of the needs corresponding to the groups of lower category. So I will talk, in this talk I will try to explain the notion of hierarchical choice, and I will emphasize the work of René Roy, because I think it is work that is not, at least I didn't know, but I guess some other people were not aware of this work. Then I will apply this notion of hierarchical choice to the concept of an order of acquisition of durable goods and assets. This idea of an order of acquisition of durable goods was put forth, introduced a long time ago by a colleague of mine who is still living and close to 90, I think, in a paper, in several papers, one of them in Econometrica in 1965. So, but I will not only explain, how you can derive such an order using the approach of Parouche, of Jacob Parouche, but I will also explain that you can use another approach, which is common in psychometrics, called item response theory. Then I'll give you an empirical illustration based on the Eurobarometer survey of 2019, and I'll show you the results we get when we apply the approach of Parouche and then item response theory. And then I will derive a measure of inequality, poverty, and welfare. From this information we can get on the order of acquisition of durable goods and assets in each country. And then I will also apply this approach using the 2013 Israeli Social Survey, because to find out what is the order of curtailment of expenditure. When you start being poor, what are the expenditures that you first cut, and then the second one, and so on. So we can apply this idea of order both concerning the acquisition of durable goods or assets more generally, or concerning the curtailment, the cutback of expenditure. Okay, so economic and hierarchical choice. Let me start by citing René Roy. We consider it essential to link the phenomena of consumption and consequently of demand to the concept of hierarchy of needs. Now, this notion of a hierarchy of need is not new, and apparently it appears, I didn't check whether this was correct, I found this in a paper, but apparently Plato in his famous Republic wrote that the first and the greatest of our needs is the provision of food to support existence and life. The second, the provision of a dwelling place. And the third, of clothing. It's quite interesting that he puts dwelling place before clothing, but it's all right. So, much later, several economists such as Adam Smith, Jean-Baptiste Say, Jevons, Menger, and Marshall were also aware of the importance of the distinction between basic and non-basic needs. But incorporating hierarchy into the formalistic methodology of the marginalists was not an easy task, as this is probably why this hierarchical approach to decision-making did not become very popular. But you find something around this notion, even in Adam Smith, You cannot do a talk if you don't, in economics, if you don't cite Adam Smith. So in the Wealth of Nations, and I think the citation I will give you is quite known, this is what Adam Smith wrote. By necessaries, I understand not only the commodities which are indispensably necessary for the support of life, but whatever the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable people, even of the lowest order, to be without. A linen shirt, for example, is, strictly speaking, not a necessary of life. The Greeks and the Romans lived, I suppose, very comfortably, though they had no linen. But in the present times, in times of Adam Smith, through the greater part of Europe, a creditable day laborer would be ashamed to appear in public, I put a K because this is how it appears in Adam Smith's work, without a linen shirt, the want of which would be supposed to denote that disgraceful degree of poverty which it is presumed nobody can well fall into without extreme bad conduct. Custom, in the same manner, has rendered leather shoes as a necessary of life in England. The poorest creditable person of either sex would be ashamed to appear in public without them. Now, this notion of needs, of order of needs, appear also in the work of Karl Menger, Grundsätze, in second edition that was published in 1923. He had a chapter in this second edition on the theory of needs. And Menger wrote that the starting point for any investigation of economic theory is needy human nature. Without needs, there would be no economy, no national economy, no economic science. And Menger makes a distinction between need, Bedürfnis in German, and its satisfier provision, Bedarf in German, which is defined as a quantity of consumption goods a person must have to satisfy his needs. The former notion is considered as subjective, the latter as objective. Even Keynes, in an essay on economic possibilities for our grandchildren, wrote that there are two types of needs, absolute and relative. While absolute needs are satiable, relative needs are not because they satisfy the desire for superiority. For Lutz and Lux, in a paper published in 1979, needs can be hierarchically classified and determine consumers' behavior. Wants are derived from needs and may be substituted for each other. For Dracopoulos, the paper that I'm quite citing a lot, a need implies something which is universally necessary, while a want refers to a personal preference, and the latter is a trait of the individual. This is why there may be an important degree of substitution between wants, while there is likely to be only a weak degree of substitution between needs, which are assumed to be universal. In fact, Ulrich Schmidt, a friend of mine, wrote that there is a biological foundation of certain basic needs like thirst, hunger, sex, and they are fixed and universally shared. Once the basic needs are satisfied, consumers move on to satisfy other needs that may be learned. So let me say a few additional words on the notion of hierarchical choice. George Scurrogan, I think that's the way you pronounce it, in 1954 wrote that it has long since been observed that human needs and wants are hierarchized. Satisfaction of concrete needs have different degree of importance to us. Despite the fact that the want pattern differs from one individual to another, most of these patterns have a great deal in common. First, the hierarchy of wants seems to be for all men identical up to a certain rank. One may be almost sure that this refers to thirst, hunger, leisure, shelter. Individuals belonging to the same culture are likely to have in common still a greater number of wants at the top of the hierarchy than those common to all men. Choice aims at satisfying the greatest number of wants, starting with the most important one and going down the hierarchy. Even Joan Robinson, cited in the paper by Lavoie, she wrote, generally speaking, wants stand in a hierarchy, though with considerable overlaps at each level. And an increment in a family's real income is not devoted to buying a little more of everything at the same level, but to stepping down the hierarchy. And an economist of the name of Ashner wrote, in an economy that is expanding over time, it is the income effect that will predominate over the relative price or substitution effect. Substitution can take place only within fairly narrow subcategories. Consumers' preferences are, in this sense, lexicographically ordered. For Lavoie, once physiological needs are fulfilled, there will be still a common hierarchy of needs for individuals who share a similar culture. Consumers tend to imitate the behavior of those who are higher in the hierarchy of society. And this idea of relative position of consumer, you all know the work of Veblen, Duesenberry, and Leibenstein. Let me say a little bit more about the approach of René Roy, because when I was a student, an undergraduate student in Paris, I remember there was a seminar, Roy-Malinvaux. Malinvaux, for those who teach econometrics, has a very important, he died already, but he has an important textbook in econometrics, a very thick one. And I remember when I was an undergraduate student, there was a seminar, Roy-Malinvaux. That's all I knew about René Roy. But here is what I found that he wrote. Whatever the importance of the income, there exists for each individual a certain order of priority relative to the allocation of its resources to each type of article. This classification in individual needs could be highlighted by a method analogous to that which was used by Dupuy in 1844 for the appreciation of the utility of the various goods. And here's what Dupuy wrote. 180 years ago. It would be enough, assuming that all prices remain constant, to imagine that the income of the individual in question decreases progressively in such a way that he is obliged to gradually eliminate the article which he considers the least indispensable. The classification would obviously not be the same for all individuals because of difference in taste. But one can imagine the possibility of forming groups of items, such that for all individuals, the order of priority is observable, not from one item to another, but from one group to the other. The categories in question would ultimately reflect the hierarchy of needs, while within these categories, the selection of items would be made according to individual taste. We therefore make a distinction between needs and taste. This is what Dupuy wrote in 1844. In another paper, René Roy writes that with regard especially to the phenomena of consumption, we finally think that the notion of urgency in the satisfaction of human needs tends to create a scale of consumer goods which can thus be classified into groups, while the notion of taste manifests itself within each group by fixing the choice of each consumer on the articles corresponding to his personal preferences. Within this group, the phenomena that we know well of complementarity or substitution appear, which thus contribute to fixing the demand of consumer for the various articles considered separately. And René Roy added, we have implicitly assumed that prices are given because theoretically the order of succession of goods for a consumer depends on the relative values of prices. But the price variation do not affect, in our view, the general arrangement of the scales, because by triggering substitution phenomena, they only move the scale inside each group and only modify their respective position without altering the classification of groups. The notion of hierarchy of needs and consequently of commodities is in fact governed by motives of a physiological, moral, or psychological order, indifferent to a large extent to the price movement that one observes in practice. And here again what René Roy writes. Given the assumption made about the allocation of income, any price variation concerning a group of rank I will have no influence on the demand of the groups of lower order, while it will have an impact not only on the demand for group I, but on those of all groups of higher order. We can express this fact by saying that price variation for luxury items have no influence on the demand for basic necessities, or on that of products that simply provide a degree of comfort that cannot be assimilated to luxury. If we want to concretize our thought further, we can still say that the variation in the price of champagne wine will not have an influence on the consumption of table wine. But conversely, a variation in the price of table wine may indeed act on the demand for champagne wine. By limiting ourselves to two goods, writer René Roy, bread and wine, for example, and by admitting that each consumer has free access to all the water he needs, we come to the following conclusion. Every consumer first allocates his income to the acquisition of bread until he obtains the satiety of his needs for food. And for a homogeneous group of consumers, this satiety is obtained for a substantially constant consumption of bread, whoever is a consumer. Once satiety has been obtained for the need for food, every consumer allocates a surplus of his income to the acquisition of wine. The demand for bread is independent of the price of wine, but the demand for wine depends on the price of bread. The notion of groups, writes René Roy, rests precisely on the hypothesis that the degree of urgency of the various needs experienced by men is linked to their physiological nature, to their psychological state, to mores, or to the organization of society, in a word, to a whole set of factors independent of the price level. It is only within each group that the respective levels of the various prices, combined with individual taste, directs the demands towards this or that article by the mechanism of substitution. So this was, I emphasize what René Roy wrote because I think it's not very well known, at least was not known to me. Now there are implications of what I just cited concerning the Engel curve. In what is considered the first statistical analysis of budget, Engel proposed the following law of consumption, as you know. The poorer family, the greater the proportion of its total expenditures that must be devoted to the provision of food. And then some people extended, this law. An economist in 1875 who according to George Stigler, he made an excessive free translation of Engel's law, because he said, first, the greater the income, the smaller the relative percentage of outlay on subsistence. Second, the percentage of outlay on clothing is approximately the same, whatever the income. Third, the percentage of outlay for lodging or rent and for fuel and light is invariably the same, whatever the income. Fourth, as the income increases in amount, the percentage of outlay on sundries become greater. And some people have even added, Schwabe, the poorer anyone is, the greater the amount relative to his income that he must spend on housing. And also somebody else, right? The higher the income, generally speaking, the greater the saving actually and proportionately. So two contemporary economists, Andreas Schei and Moneta, I forgot the name Moneta, I know Schei quite well. Engels shifted the focus of research away from examining how expenditure is distributed across individual goods consumed toward focusing on how it is distributed across wants, which goods ultimately satisfy. Actually, this emphasis on wants appears already in Engels' work, since he did not really focus his attention on food expenditure, but on nourishment, which also included expenditure on alcohol and tobacco. According to Schei and Moneta, Engels believed that his empirical analysis showed that there was a hierarchy among wants, the most important one being the want for nourishment. Then there was a want for clothing, accommodation, heating, and lighting. And Engels stressed that when a family is not able to satisfy all its wants, it is likely to decide not to satisfy higher order wants so that it can satisfy its basic wants. Now, the most famous approach to the idea that there is a hierarchy of needs is that of Maslow, and he has a certain number. I'm going to shorten, not go into these details, but I guess many of you know about Maslow's categorization that Maslow did. And here is again, let me go back to the French economist, engineer economist Dupuy in the middle of the 19th century. He wrote that if when the insufficiency of the harvest is a tenth, everyone reduced their consumption by a tenth, there would be doubtless be deprivation. However, the suffering would nowhere be very acute. But this is not the way things are. However expensive bread may be, it is still for the rich and well-to-do classes the most economical food. And for them, the high price of bread is never a reason to consume less. The rich or well-to-do household that spend 400 francs on bread will spend 800 if the price doubles. But the expenditure on other items in his budget is reduced by 400 francs, which is nothing for them. If half the population consumes in times of scarcity the same quantity of bread as in times of plenty, then all the deprivation must fall on the other half. It is then no longer a question of a tenth, but of a fifth. And such a reduction in food is distributed in a very unequal way among the lower classes, according to the resources at their disposal. And afterwards, this deprivation of bread entails many others, because to satisfy this imperious need of hunger, the poor sells his clothes, his blankets, his mattresses, deprives himself of wood, of light, and thus suffering from hunger, cold, and humidity, he falls prey to disease and finds only in death the end of his suffering. Okay, I'm going to cut a little bit. And obviously, the story I'm telling has implication concerning the diversity of expenditure. Andreas Chai and co-author, using data from the 2001 cross-section of the UK Household Expenditure Survey, and they gathered this information on 5,000 households over 12 different categories, they measured diversity over different expenditure levels. They concluded that at low income levels, households have relatively concentrated spending patterns, but they tend to diversify their spending quickly as their income rises. At the same time, the level of heterogeneity in spending diversity also grows with income. In another paper, Andreas Chai and co-author concluded their empirical investigation by stressing that among low levels of per capita GDP spending, diversity grows via a diversification of the food diet of the consumer, while at higher levels of per capita GDP, spending diversification takes place via an increase in the range of services consumed. Okay, now let me go to the section which concerns more work I've done. We have hitherto focused our attention on the notion of hierarchical choice in history of economic thought. And let's now turn to one aspect of this choice, which is the concept that there is an order of acquisition of durable goods and assets. We'll show that there are two main approaches to the derivation of such an order. One is inspired by Gutmann's work on the scaling of qualitative data, and this led my colleague Jacob Parush to assume that there is an order of acquisition of durable goods and to propose an approach allowing one to discover such an order. The other approach is borrowed from the field of psychometrics and applies the technique known as item response theory to the derivation of such an order of acquisition of durable goods and assets. So let's first talk about the approach of Jacob Parush. I'll take a simple example. Let's assume we have information on the ownership of 3 durable goods: a refrigerator, a television, and a car. So an individual or household can own 1, 2, 3, or none of these durable goods. It is easy to derive that there are 8 possible profiles of ownership of these 3 durable goods. Here you have the table. So we have 3 goods, and if the household owns a refrigerator, we'll write a 1. If it does not, we'll write 0. Same thing for a television and a car. And you can see that there are here 8 possibilities. Because, 1 means that the case 1, or ownership profile 1, means you do not have any of these 3 durable goods. Profile 2 shows that you have only a refrigerator. Profile 3, that you have only a television. Profile 4, only a car. And then 5, 6, 7 shows you possible combination when you have 2 goods. And 8 is when you have everything. Now, our goal, or the goal of Parush, was to find out what is the order of acquisition, or the most common order of acquisition in society, assuming you have only 3 goods: refrigerator, television, and car. So we want to find a way of determining the most common order. So let's assume, first we will assume a given order, and we'll draw a conclusion. And then we'll take all the other possibilities into account. So let's assume that a household, an individual, acquires first a refrigerator, then a television, and then a car. Now, if you go back to this table, what are the possible ownership profiles? Well, 1 is okay because it doesn't have anything. We said refrigerator, only refrigerator. 2 is okay because there's a refrigerator, nothing else. But profile 3 and 4 are not possible because we said he first acquired a refrigerator. So 3 and 4 are not possible. 5 is okay because we said he first owned a refrigerator, then he acquired a television. So 5 is okay. 6 and 7 are not okay because they assume a different order, and 8 is possible. So we have only the possibility, if you assume an individual first acquires a refrigerator, then a television, then a car, the only possible profiles are 1, 2, 5, and 8. Okay? Now, the profiles 3, 4, 6, and 7, therefore, are not possible. But it is clear that not every household will buy first a refrigerator, then a television, and a car, because other sequences of acquisition exist. So even if you find out what's the most, and I'll explain to you, what the most common order of acquisition of durable goods is, there will always be some household or individual that will deviate from this most common order. So let me, get rid of, going back to the example. Let's assume that an individual has profile 4, which means he has only a car. He doesn't have a refrigerator. He does not have a television. So, and let's assume that the order we are looking at is, as I said, first refrigerator, then a television, then a car. So we are going to compute how distant this individual is from this order that we just mentioned, which is refrigerator, television, and car. So I put 0 in this table, 0 and 1. So if you look at profile 1, at profile 4, which is what we assume the individual is, and we are going to compare this with the 4 possible profiles, which are profile 1, 2, 5, and 8, if you assume that the order is refrigerator, television, and a car. So if you compare profile 4 with 1, you can see that the distance, 0, you compare 4 with 1, so for refrigerator, there's no distance. For television, 0 against 0, but a car is 1 against 0. So here the distance is 1 compared to profile 1. Now we said profile 2 is possible. The distance is, for a refrigerator, is 0 against 1, so 1. For a television, there are no differences, 0, 0. And for a car, there is a difference, 1, 0, so the distance is 2. Then we said the other profile which is possible is 5. You buy first a refrigerator, then a television. If we compare the profile of the individual, profile 4, with profile 5, we will see that the distance is 3. 0, 1 plus 0, 1 plus 1, 0, so it's 3. And the last possible profile is 8. If we compare 4 with 8, we're going to have 1 plus 1 plus 0, so 2. So here are the results. The smallest distance is 1 for the individual, which I called individual 4. Now we have to do this for each individual, assuming the order is refrigerator, then you acquire television, then you acquire a car. So you do this for every individual. You compute DI is the distance for each individual, G is a maximum distance. You do a weighted average and you get some index, D bar SI, and the complement to 1 gives you the proximity, what has been called a proximity index by Parouche or maybe by Gutmann, I don't remember. Now, how many orders there are? We said there are G is a maximum. There are actually factorial G possible orders. So you can imagine, let's assume, in our example, we have 2,000 households, which is quite common in a survey, and 10 goods. So 10 goods means 11 comparison. Either you have nothing or 1 or 2 or 3, okay? So 2,000 times 11 is already 22,000 comparison. But you have to repeat this factorial 10 times. Okay, because these are all the possible orders. And you end up with a big number, 22,000 times 3,600,000, 800. So big number, which at the time of that Parouche wrote his article, he didn't work with so many households, not with so many goods. because they did everything by hand. It was in the 60s. But today with a computer, you can easily find the most common order of acquisition, and I've done it in several papers with my colleague Deutsch. So this is the approach of Parush. The other approach is that of item response theory, which is a technique which is usually common for psychological or educational assessment. It is used to analyze the result of psychometric tests, the idea being that the probability of giving a correct answer to a question in a test is a function of the intelligence or the ability of the examinee. But intelligence or ability is not a characteristic that can be measured. It is a latent trait. So you rely on the answer given to a certain number of questions. If the answer is correct, you give a 1, otherwise you give 0. And then you can draw, if A refers to the ability of an individual and P has a probability that he gives a correct answer, usually the link is an S-shaped curve, like this, called an item characteristic curve. It's a logistic function, okay? We can do the same thing, not so much with poverty, but with richness, okay? Where the richness R refers not only to material wealth, but to other positive aspects of life, such as good health, good relation with family. So if P of R is a probability that an individual owns a given durable good, if he owns a refrigerator, he gets 1, otherwise 0, and you can get the same kind of curve. Here you have 2 typical item characteristics curves, a cell phone and a dryer, okay? And if you can see that here in this example, you first acquire a cell phone and then a dryer, okay? Actually, this curve there are 2 measures which should be stressed. First is order, whether a cell phone comes before a dryer and so on, and also the slope of this S-shaped curve, because the more vertical the slope is, the more it makes a discrimination between those who do not have and those who have the good, okay? An extreme case would be something like this. Up to some level of richness, you do not have the good, and as soon as the richness RC, you own the good. Okay, I will not go into this. And there is a whole literature on deriving the order acquisition of durable goods and assets. Here I'm citing a lot of papers, and same thing for item response theory. Those who are interested, I can send them these references. So we apply this idea to the 2019 Eurobarometer survey. This survey covered 35 countries, France, Belgium, etc. And we worked with 12 durable goods: phone, mobile phone, television, DVD, CD player, computer, laptop, tablet, smartphone, internet, car, and a house which is already paid for. And we wanted to, as you can guess, to find out what is the order of acquisition of these 12 durable goods in each country. But here you have the results. For example, in the case of Portugal, you find that the order of acquisition is a television, then a mobile phone, then a car, then the internet, smartphone, laptop, tablet, DVD, CD player, house, computer. We did the same thing using item response theory. So we have done it using the Parush approach, item response theory, and we computed for each country the correlation coefficient. And the correlation coefficient is very high, 0.9, if not 0.95. So it doesn't really matter whether you use item response theory or the algorithm of Parush, which is probably more complicated and less common in canned programs, so you can use item response theory if you want. And then we regress the rank correlation between the order acquisition of 2 countries on the absolute value of the difference between the per capita GDP of these 2 countries. And it turns out that there is a link. The greater the gap between the per capita GDP of these two countries, the less similar will be the order of acquisition, okay? The coefficient of absolute value of this per capita GDP difference is negative, insignificant, and the R-square for regression is 0.38 if you use the Parush approach and 0.46. So there is a link between the per capita GDP and the order of acquisition of durable goods. Now, our idea was, not really to derive the order of acquisition because this has appeared in other papers, but we wanted to apply this idea to the measurement of inequality, poverty, and welfare. Because once we have the order of acquisition of durable goods in a given country, we know which percentage of individuals do not have any good, which percentage has one durable good, two durable goods, and so on. And this information allows us to apply relatively recent work in past 10 years or 15 years on using special indices to measure inequality, poverty, and welfare, because these indices which have been introduced in recent years assume the existence of an order. It's not that you know exactly the income and then you compute some Gini index or whatever. You have here ordinal information, not cardinal information. And there is a whole literature in recent years on how to measure inequality, poverty, or welfare when you have only ordinal variables, which is what we have here. We know the percent of people have no good, one good, two goods, and so on. So here I give you the references for example for the measurement of inequality. The most famous paper on this topic is by Allison and Jim Foster in 2004, and then you have additional paper in by Benedict Apoué, Abul-Naga and Yalcin, Reardon, and so on. Corwell and Flasher. Okay. For poverty, when you have ordinal variables, obviously the most famous approach is that of Alcaira and Foster in two papers, 2011, and the generalization of the 2011 paper in 2019, but also I think we should mention a paper by Ripin, who did a PhD with the late Stefan Classen in Göttingen. And finally, concerning measurement of welfare, of achievement, I wrote a paper with Benedict Apoué and Yongsheng Xu in 2018, which derived axiomatically new classes of measure of the level of achievement, where the achievement depends not only on the average, let's say the percentage of goods you have, but also on the inequality of the achievement. So here I'm not going to go into the detail of the measure which have been introduced. For example, for inequality, there's an index for, everything is for ordinal variable. So Abul-Naga and Yalcin propose a measure, and Benedict Apoué another measure, and LV, I don't know how to pronounce it, LV, some Chinese economists proposed two other measures, and Reardon also proposed measure. He applied it to the measurement of segregation when you have specific information segregation, but you can apply it also to measuring the inequality with ordinal variables. So here I present for each country the result. I'm not going to go into the details. Ordinal inequality indices computed using the Parush approach. And I use the Abul-Naga-Yalcin approach, Apoué, Lv, and co-author, and Reardon. And, well, I don't want to enter into detail, but the index proposed by these Chinese economists, Lv and co-author, turns out one of them is identical to an index defined by Reardon, the other by an index defined by Abul-Naga and Yalcin. But whatever index you use, it shows that inequality is highest in Hungary and Slovakia, and lowest in the Netherlands and Denmark, when you use the Parush approach. If you use item response theory, you get very similar results. And we computed the correlation between inequality indices derived from the approach of Parush and those from applying item response theory correlation are high, 0.75, 0.8, 0.9. So it doesn't really matter whether you use a Parrish approach or item response theory. Here you have the correlation between the different indices, inequality indices. When you use the Parrish approach, you can see it doesn't matter also which index, which ordinal inequality index you use. Now, concerning poverty, obviously here we have to do with multidimensional poverty because you can have one good, two goods, and so on. So here the most famous measure is that was introduced by Alkire and Foster, with dichotomous variable. Assume dichotomous variable. And as you know, if you use a union approach, you assume, in fact, that the various assets are perfect complements, so that as soon as one asset is missing, you will be considered as poor. The intersection approach, on the other side, assumes that assets are perfect substitute, so that an individual or household will be considered as poor only if she doesn't have any asset. And Alkire and Foster, in a famous paper in 2011, proposed an intermediate approach where you do not assume either the union or the intersection approach, but you decide about a critical threshold, and you say those who are below this critical threshold will be considered as poor, and the other one not as poor. Okay, I guess many of you know these indices, and the index proposed by Alkire and Foster is a multiplication of two indexes, one which is a proportion of individuals who are considered as poor, H, times A. What is A is a proportion of assets that these poor individuals do not have. So I don't want to go into the mathematics. Again, those who are, most of you must be aware of it, and those who are interested, I can send them this PowerPoint. Okay. Now there have been other counting approaches. These are called counting approach because we deal with ordinal variables, and Ripin, extended this ordinal approach, and I will not go into details. So we computed here multidimensional poverty indices using, again, the approach of Parrish for each of the country. So here we have one index is H, the percentage of multidimensional poor. A is what I just defined, and M0 is the index defined by Alkire and Foster. Then I said that Alkire and Foster in 2019 extended their approach, and you have also the Ripin index. And if you look at the correlation, some of them are low, but a lot of them are quite high. So it makes a difference which index you use, but if you exclude H and A, which are part of M0, once you use either the index introduced by Alkire Foster or the generalization, M02, which I introduced 8 years later, or the Ripin index, you will see that the correlation is high. The last thing, kind of computation which can be done is measuring a kind of welfare, which is actually deriving, working with an inequality-sensitive and additive achievement measure, which with two co-authors of mine, Benedict Apue and Yang-Sheng Xu, we proposed in a paper which was published 2018. And the idea here that concerning achievement, I think in the paper we focused on health achievement, We had, whether you're very not healthy at all, not so healthy, very healthy, something like this. And we derived axiomatically, not me, Yang-Sheng Xu is a specialist of axiomatics, and derived an index which not only measured the average achievement, but took into account the inequality among the individuals. So this is a measure of achievement which gives a penalty when there is a more inequality among the achievement of the different individuals. I do not want to enter into the detail of its formulation, But if you're only interested in the average achievement and not in inequality, then there is a specific case where you get the second formula. So that's up to you to decide whether when measuring achievement with ordinal data you want to take into account inequality or you do not want. So we apply this again to the data we were working with. And again, you can see that our achievement index, so it has a parameter alpha. I don't want to enter into the detail. It doesn't really matter whether you use alpha 0.5 or 0.99, the correlation is very high. Okay. Up to now, I'm talking about the order of acquisition of durable goods. Now I want to say a few words about the opposite story. You start having financial problem, and you need to cut your expenditure. Which expenditure are you going to cut first, second, etc.? So, and how do we discover this order of curtailment of expenditure? Well, we can use the same kind of algorithm. So we focus on the reverse situation. We want to find out the order of curtailment of expenditure. Now, for example, in 2013, with my colleague Joseph Deutsch and a former student of mine, Adil Azhar, we used the 2003 Israeli Social Survey, which provided detailed information on the consumption of various health and non-health related goods. So here are, for example, the question: did the individual forego dental work in the past 12 months? Or buying prescription drugs? Or receiving medical treatment? Or renouncing to have additional health insurance? Or did the individual forego heating the dwelling? Or buying clothing or shoes? Or was the electricity or the phone service cut? That's not a decision of the individual, but it is a consequence of the difficult financial situation of the individual. Did the individual sometimes not eat because he did not have enough money? And we computed the order of curtailment of expenditure, and we found out it was you first cut clothing and shoes, then dental work, then heating or cooling, then food, then prescription drugs, and so on. In another study using European data, we tried to derive the same kind of information. We called it the deprivation sequence in a paper published by my co-author, Anne-Catherine Guillot and co-author. Here was the information we used. Were you not able to replace worn-out clothes? Were you not able to acquire 2 pairs of properly fitting shoes? These are questions that appear in a European survey. Were you prevented from spending a small amount of money each week on yourself without having to consult anyone? Were you prevented from meeting with friends and family for a drink, a meal at least monthly? Were you prevented from having regular leisure activity? From replacing worn-out furniture, not having a meal with meat, chicken, and so on. So all kinds of questions that appear for each of the European country. And the order of curtailment, we computed the order for each of the EU countries, but here I give you the order of curtailment for the whole European Union. So you first cut holidays, then unexpected expenses, furniture, leisure, pocket money, a drink or meal out, clothes, meat, chicken, and fish, keeping a home warm, a car, arrears in payment, computer, internet, and shoes. Interesting that computer, internet comes very last in the order of curtailment. We have done also this kind of computation using data for Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, but I'm not going to present this result. Let me present result on the last survey in Israel on which we had this kind of information, the Israel Social Survey of 2013. The questions were as follows. In the last 12 months, because of financial difficulties, have you given up food, a hot meal at least once every 2 days, inviting family members or friends over a meal, buying clothes or shoes, unexpected expenses such as gift for a family event or car repair, a hobby or leisure activity, heating or cooling your home adequately, repairing defects in your apartment such as dampness in the apartment or a leaking roof, replacing worn or broken furniture, replacing broken electronics or electric appliances, dental care, medical treatment, prescription drugs. The ranking, you did this with the PowerShell approach and item response theory, and the ranking between the two approaches is very similar because we found a correlation coefficient of 0.99, and well, I'm not going to give you the rank. I just put the code of the goods, but I didn't write down. So those who are interested, I can send them the paper. So we can even compute some poverty line. We can decide that there are 65% of people, of households that did not curtail any expenditure. So if you use this, you can consider that at least as soon as you curtail one expenditure, you will be considered as poor. In such case, there are 35% of households that are poor. But you can decide to be considered poor, you need to curtail 2 or 3 expenditure, and so on. And we can compute using this information inequality indices and whether the alkali foster and so on. So we can do the same thing. What I want to say, I don't want to spend time on the results. What I want to say is we can apply the same idea that we did for order of acquisition of durable goods, we can apply it to the order of curtailment of expenditure. At the last stage of our analysis, we did some ordered logit regression. The dependent variable was the probability of curtailing 0, 1, 2, k types of expenditure, and as explanatory variable, different variable. And here are the results we obtained. All the heads of household curtail less their expenditure, which is not surprising. And it also, in Israel, we make a distinction with the country of origin, if people were born in Israel, in Europe, America, or Asia, Africa. And so people born in Europe, America apparently have a wealthier background, so they curtail less their expenditure. Married and single heads of household curtail less their expenditure than divorced or widower. It's true at least with the parish approach. Heads of household that are in good health, Jewish household, and more educated household are also less likely to curtail their expenditure. And obviously, the higher the per capita income, the lower the probability that you are going to curtail your expenditure. Okay, I think it's about time to finish, right? Yes. So what I've tried to show you, I started by reviewing some literature. I was not really too much aware of it on the concept of hierarchical choice. And then I applied this idea to 2 topics, the idea of an order of acquisition of durable goods and the idea of an order of curtailment of expenditure. And we tried to find out whether we got reasonable results, and we did also regression. So we can use the information we get on the order of acquisition of durable goods or the order of curtailment of expenditure. We can use this information to compute what are ordinal indices of inequality, of poverty, of welfare that are relevant when you have ordinal data. Because you cannot use, let's say, an inequality index like the Gini index when you have ordinal data. And although I didn't spend much time on analyzing with you the results, this idea of order acquisition, order curtailment allows you to compute measure of poverty, of inequality, of welfare, and can give you an information which is quite useful if you want to find out what the state of a country. So I think I will stop here because I've been talking for a long time. Thank you.
Okay, good. So thank you, Professor Silber, and let's go to questions. There must be a microphone somewhere.
So everything was clear, right? Okay.
Questions? You really don't want me to ask questions, right?
Okay.
Okay, so let's close the meeting, I assume. Unless, Miguel, you want to ask a question. I'm putting you on the spot, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jacques, for the wonderful talk. My question is the following. I know that you talk about the hierarchical choice, and you started talking about lexicographic preferences. What's the relations between a pre-order and lexicographic preferences between the hierarchical approach? Is there a connection? It's completely different. Are you listening?
Okay, if you talk slowly so that
okay, sorry. Normally, when we're doing choices, we have choices over a set and things like that. Here you were doing choices among a set and using groups and to hierarchize the sets. The question is, if you have a pre-order mathematically, there are also lexicographic preferences. We know that people tend to choose sometimes in a lexicographic way, like there is a kind of belonging. It's a kind of, you try to hierarchize the choices. My question is very simple. Your approach, which is very deep and profound and very well rounded and all of that, what's the relation, if there is and if there isn't, between hierarchical choice and lexicographical preferences? Because it's completely different. And we know, for instance, what I mean with this is that we are assuming rationality, we are assuming intent. For instance, there is this guy, Jacques Silber, a philosopher, which says that rationality must be called upon intent. It's not just not making mistakes, okay? So my question is the following. Sometimes we choose by impulse, and lexicographic preferences, you were saying, okay, they choose first the car, then the refrigerator, then TV, or things like that. And you covered all of this, okay? Either with the Parosh approach or the item response theory. Is it possible to understand how the lexicographic approach and this way of intent by seals is related to your approach by the hierarchical choice? Is it related, yes or no? This is just a question. It's a difficult question.
Jackie, you can use the microphone.
Now,
I can strengthen the question in the following sense. At the beginning, you talk about groups of commodities, but in the example that you gave us, it was very clear that it's lexicographic. So what I expected, or what Miguel expected, is show me refrigerator number 1, Sony, and refrigerator number 2, I don't know what, and show me that there is substitution. And then show me, I don't know, TV 1 and 2 and 3 and so on and so on. So show me the group, and then I can say that this is hierarchical, whatever you call it. It's in hierarchy. Whereas in the example you gave, we only had the lexicographic. That's your question, I think.
Yes, yes.
No, it's true that, I emphasize that the hierarchy is among group of goods, and in the empirical illustration, I give goods. So it's, I don't know whether it's data scarcity, but we had this information. Yeah, but you are right that I probably should have been more careful to say that the empirical illustration is not exactly what I said in the... Okay.
More questions? The student who is holding the microphone, what about your question?
Very good presentation. Thanks for coming.
Forget about the blah blah. Go ahead. Questions.
And later on, there is a cocktail around 7. So you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, in this case, thank you very much, and I'm closing the session. Oh, okay, there is an organizational. Remember, we have a tour today. Ah, wow, there is a present to the presenters.
Yeah, they have it.
I'll give you. This is just a souvenir. You can open it. You can open it. It's made of pork. It's a small briefcase made of pork. As you know, pork is a kind of traditional material here.
Thank you so
Évora,
much.
So this is just a souvenir.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a
Okay,
lot.
thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you, Lizanne.
I think Elena is trying to have a meeting. They have a meeting by. Thank
So
you.
The next order is what the tour of the city at 6 p.m. A parallel session now.
So now we will have parallel sessions till 6. There will be a tour at 6 o'clock. At 7 we'll be back here at the auditorium to give an award to José Roquette from 7 to 7:15. And at 7:15 we'll go to the main cloister to have a cocktail that everybody was talking about. Okay? So let's proceed with the works. Thank you a lot. Thank you, Jacques. Thank you, Joachim. Okay, thank you. I didn't want to question, but because